Let me pull one more chair up. And then I'll pull one more out.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the forum this evening, although it seems that the winter is a little bit back and it's raining. I'm Shigeru Shimizu, co-chair of Japanese Student Caucus here at Kennedy School. It's our great honor to have Mr. Yasuhisa Shiozaki, member of the Japanese Diet, today. Being an alumnus of Kennedy School, MPA year 1982, it's quite natural that Mr. Shiozaki is one of the most distinguished politicians in Japan. And after his opening remarks, we have a panelist, discussion among panelists, Professor Ezra Vogel, Lecturer Itaka Kawashima, and Dr. William Overholt. And our moderator today is our Dean, Joseph S. Nye, Jr. I don't think we need a further explanation about a dean, so please join me welcoming our dean with a big hand.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have a chance to welcome back to the Kennedy School Yasuhisa Shiozaki, who is one of Japan's rising political stars. But it's particularly gratifying to us at the Kennedy School to welcome him back because he's a wonderful reaffirmation of the Kennedy School's mission, which is to train public leaders. He began his career in banking, but I'm glad to say that after 10 years with the Bank of Japan, he came to the Kennedy School, and after graduating from the Kennedy School, he's been actively involved in public life. He has been a political assistant to the Minister of Japan's Economic Planning Agency and the Minister for Management Coordination before being elected to the Diet in 1993. It is a distinguished rise in his career since then, to the point that people are talking about him as now one of Japan's leading younger generation of political leaders. So it's an honor for us to welcome back to the Kennedy School an astute public leader who is at home here in this forum, and we hope that he will inspire many of others of you to follow his footsteps. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Shiozaki back to the Kennedy School.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Nye, for your kind introduction. And also, thank you, Shimizu-san, for allowing me to make a sentimental journey back to Cambridge, lovely second hometown of mine, with good memories as well as tough ones of, tough professors with a pile of reading assignments and homeworks. And tonight, I'm very honored to speak to the distinguished group of people, you, and the faculty as well as the best students from all over the world, about changes happening in Japan. And always thinking globally is a wonderful tradition of this great school, and I'm very proud of being part of this tradition. As I recall my days in the Kennedy School, some 20 years ago, President Reagan came into office in the midst of Cold War, when the United States economy seemed to have lost its competitive edge and was suffering from the so-called twin deficits. On the other hand, Japan was praised as #1 and its competitiveness was perceived to be a model to be learned. In fact, in Professor Vogel and Professor Robert Reich's class, I made a presentation on the excellence of Japanese industrial policy at that time. Over the past 2 decades, however, all this has changed dramatically. In contrast with the United States, which re-emerged with remarkable productive growth, Japan, after experiencing the asset price bubble in the late 1980s and subsequent burst, has continued to decline, which already lasted over a decade. The decade was lost in political terms as well. There were 7 prime ministers before the present Junichiro Koizumi, and their average duration in office was 495 days, too short for a prime minister to deliver his own policy with a strategy based on clearly defined national interest. After this lost decade, Japan is now filled with pessimism. Sometimes I feel even pre-revolution atmosphere in the society. People have stopped trusting the government when it says Japan is okay. It is true that LDP-led coalition government stays in power, but it is because people mistrust the opposition parties as well. People doubt the efficacy of the Japanese system itself. The past success model of Japan was supported by the so-called Iron Triangle, which consists of comfortable relationship among bureaucrats, businessmen, and politicians. This triangle supported the famous Japan Inc., which was best described by Michael Gorbachev of the Soviet Union when he paradoxically said that Japan was the most successful socialist economy in the world. But in the 1990s, too many policy errors and mistakes were made in Japan, just like in many truly socialist countries, which demonstrated that the system did not ensure good performance. With respect to what I consider to be systemic problem of Japan, let me make 3 points. First, bureaucratic paralysis is apparent. Our history of banking supervision tells us that prolonged financial crisis is an outcome of what I called continuity trap of bureaucracy. Bureaucrats in the ministries rarely admit their past errors. In the United States and some other countries, errors are more effectively checked by other agencies or legislators. Because of the cozy triangle, however, mistakes tended to be overlooked or even accumulated in Japan. Recent examples of this include official development aid policy in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the case of mad cow disease, or BSE, in Ministry of Agriculture. Second, political stability has also been lost. Both the ruling and opposition parties are seriously divided within each party over big policy issues such as national security and privatization of the government services. Legislation that requires a departure from the past policy always threatens a split of the party and therefore makes politics more chaotic. And third, economic uncertainty is spreading across the country. Japan's economy has experienced 3 short-term recessions during the past decade, and financial crises occurred repeatedly during these recession periods. Each recession was, however, followed by a brief and weak recovery. In recent weeks, again, an optimism is growing about the economy among Japanese policymakers against the background of inventory cyclical recovery, which benefits the manufacturing sector that accounts for only 25% of GDP. I have to put a caveat against optimism by saying that without fundamental resolution of banking problems, there will be no sustainable economic growth in Japan, which is in fact the same as I said in Washington, D.C. in 1999 when the Japanese economy was about to enter the second cyclical recovery for this decade. All those problems of Japan hinge not so much on capability of human resources as on the management. In fact, I have a strong confidence in potentials of individual Japanese. In the financial market, for example, so many banking professionals left badly managed Japanese banks, joined the foreign institutions, and successfully proved their competence, just like Ichiro Suzuki of the Seattle Mariners. It is evident that the sources of problems lie in management that cannot take advantage of talented people. Besides Ichiro and Mrs. Sadako Ogata, former High Commissioner of UNHCR, I have found a number of Japanese who display their ability, will, and performance. When I went to Afghanistan in last December, I met a lot of young Japanese working for humanitarian activities such as refugee camps near Mazar-i-Sharif, where I went. I came across a 26-year-old woman, Japanese woman, who is now directing non-government rescue team of 100 members in Kurdish villages in northern Iraq. The US State Department is about to endow this team a fairly big amount of assistance for their activities of humanitarian support, and the UK Overseas Department of Aid is also going to approve a comparable amount in consideration of strategic importance of this NGO activities. However, the Japanese Foreign Ministry has continued to refuse to assist because to support their activity means to show the flag of Japan with respect to Iraqi issues. This is another example of a systemic problem in Japan's policy making and implementation. It seems obvious to me that the system needs to be changed. Not partial improvements, but an overhaul of the system needs to be done. If you ask me in what direction the system must change, I would say that under the new system, Mrs. Sadako Ogata can play a significant role not only in the international community, but also at home. Many Ichiros would be tempted to come back to play at home, and you, young ladies and gentlemen, Americans and Japanese and other nationalities would like to work in Japanese government or corporations after you graduate from Harvard. To attract talented people to Japan, we must start with a reform of decision-making process by getting back to the basics of the parliamentary system. Parliamentary system. This is to restore the true leadership of the Prime Minister by deploying strong knowledge base independent from bureaucracy, just like the policy unit at Downing 10 in England. Such changes in the political system are prerequisites to realize the following key elements that are essential in the new government model. First, we have to clarify the roles of the government in the society. In my view, the government principal role lies in the establishment of fair playground where private initiatives ought to be rewarded properly by the market. Second, a check and balance mechanism must be installed effectively within the system. I am not merely discussing the check and balance among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government. I am speaking of check and balance mechanism within each branch, as well as between the public and the private. We know the ambition must be made to counter ambition, as James Madison correctly pointed out over 200 years ago. On the economic front, the government can contribute to this by keeping the market competitive through antitrust policy, disclosure requirements, and intellectual property rights protection. Third, coherent law enforcement constitutes a vital part of keeping the playground fair. Fair games can only be ensured by players' respect of the rules. Therefore, informal controls in the old iron triangle, that is, by comfortable relationship between players and judges, must be replaced by formal, transparent law enforcement. In this regard, judicial functions must be strengthened by an increase in the number of lawyers and judges, as well as an improvement in accessibility to legal services. By the same token, Japanese Securities Exchange Commission must be established to secure fair and competitive trading of securities. Fourth, competitive partnership with the rest of the world is also crucial for Japan to promote home market reforms. I think WTO talks and international accounting standard setting will play a vital role. Bilateral free trade agreements also offer a larger playground than home markets and gives an additional competitive impact on the domestic market. The FTA can cover a variety of areas that is not only trade policy, but science policies such as genetic engineering and high-speed internet, educational policies such as cross-border university credit exchanges, as well as health policy such as international remote medical services. With numerous daunting problems, Japan has moved only slowly during the past decade. This is because the problems are of structural nature with no strong political will to fix them. I believe it is of utmost importance to establish a new system of the country. My model, about which I have had only a limited time to discuss today, will revitalize not only the economy of Japan, but also the democracy in Japan. I also believe that time is coming ripe for the people of Japan, and a growing number of younger Diet members, though still limited, are becoming increasingly aware of the need for comprehensive change in the system, as is illustrated by their increasing support for a review of the Japanese Constitution. At this critical moment in time, I would appreciate it if you help realize my wish that someday, not remote in the future in this hall, one of you will make a presentation of Japan's success as a leading model to be learned again. Thank you very much.
Let me introduce the other panelists. To my far left, your right, is William Overholt, who is a Joint Senior Fellow at the Center for Business and Government and the Asia Center, and was head of strategy and economics at Nomura's regional headquarters in Hong Kong, and author of the book, The Rise of China. To his right, Yutaka Kawashima is also a senior fellow of the Center for Business and Government, and brings with him 40 years of experience in a diplomatic career, which reached the peak as Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs in Japan, from which he has recently resigned. And he has been a very welcome visitor and teacher here this spring. And in the middle of our panel is Ezra Vogel, Henry Ford II Research Professor Emeritus in the Social Sciences, who has been Mr. Asia at Harvard and nationally for so many years I don't know how to count them. He's concentrated on both Chinese and Japanese society, industrial development, and Asian international relations, and served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia in Washington. And his most recent book, I believe, is Japan Still Number One? And so maybe that would be the point then, Ezra, for turning to you to have your first comments.
First of all, I had the privilege of serving in Washington because I was invited by Joe Nye at that time and had the pleasure of serving under him. I also had the privilege of knowing Mr. Shiozaki when he was a student and have admired his career ever since that time. I want to make just 3 points. One is, why is a country that has such talent, such high educational level, such a high standard of living, such loyalty, such willingness to work hard, why are they in such trouble? And I think the key answer is that they have operated now in the last few years with a democracy that is very complicated, interwoven, that has required consensus to move ahead. And they had a consensus on rapid growth and worked very well. But they lack a consensus now, and they lack a system that can make those tough changes and those tough decisions that are required to really change the system that Shiozaki-san correctly said need to be changed. It's not the Japanese people are unable to do that. They did it in Meiji period when they had great statesmen. People like Yoshida Shigeru after World War II, people like Nakasone. It's that the system is so bound up that it's very difficult to move. The second point I want to make is that it's very difficult now for somebody in Shiozaki-san's position as one of our real hopes, and as somebody who's been trained not only at the Kennedy School but in the West and has enough perspective to realize what needs to be done, but it's very difficult to step out prematurely. I have another acquaintance who was a Harvard student here in the late 60s, Kato Koichi, who was a brilliant person for whom I have enormous respect. But he criticized Prime Minister Modi a little too early, and that wrecked his career. And it was a question of timing, because in order to really reorganize things, you have to have enough support. And there are still enough powers in the old system that people can't just randomly leave the new system until there is kind of a ripening that is required. My third point is that Japan still has enormous potential. I think for all the reasons that many of us know of their talent, their hard work, their high technology, it's that the people now are too satisfied, although there's a growing awareness that things need to be done. Still, life for the vast majority is a little too easy to have the tough steps, and there is nobody in the system now who can serve as a catalyst for all those changes that need to be made. So I think it has to come, and we may have to wait until the right timing, till perhaps Shiozaki-san, as one of the new young leaders, will be able to lead that reorganization, but we can't push him off the cliff too quickly. Thank you very much.
Well, I may sound a bit nationalistic, but first of all, I must say that in Cambridge, I met so many younger Japanese students. The generation is 20 years younger than I used to see in Tokyo, and very much encouraged with the vitality, the robust sort of forthcoming posture. So basically, I'm confident that the future will be bright. But having said this, we are in the period really transitions, and out of which perhaps how things can be sorted out is a bit unclear. And I fully agree with all the agenda that Mr. Shiozaki enumerated, but still, this is not going to be a smooth sailing process, because there's going to be some painful process, especially in dealing with the bad loans in the banking sectors. There have to be some more bankruptcies and some jump in the unemployment rate. But people have become pessimistic about this process because after this somewhat destructive process, there is bound to be nice recoveries, robust restarting of the growth. That sort of exit strategy part is a bit unclear. And meanwhile, I'm a bit worried that as 1 year after exactly 1 year has passed since Mr. Koizumi was installed, but already the Japanese electorate may be becoming a bit impatient about the quick fix of the reform. And as I see it, the reform process is not that easy one, and it's going to be a very painful process. And if that part is overlooked, then we'll be maybe witnessing another sort of collapse of the popularity rate, Prime Minister. In fact, while I was at the Vice Minister, I served as 3 Prime Ministers in 2 years. And that was, I mean, it's a really painful process to start from scratch. And at this time, I'm very hopeful that the Koizumi was the strong backing, although it was half of what it used to be, but 80% was too unusual, and 40 is still a high degree of confidence expressed by Japanese electorate. And I'm really hopeful that some tough decisions will be taken to restart, make possible the robust start once again. But basically, I must say, I'm in the final analysis, optimistic.
Thank you. Bill?
We all seem to be making 3 points, so I'll make 3 points too. about the sort of politics of the economics. First of all, I think if there were 25 members of the Diet like Shiozaki-san, we would be sitting here debating how quickly Japan's going to take over the United States. This is a particularly insidious kind of problem that Japan has, because everything seems fine until one day it blows up. And people live well, they shop for expensive things on the Ginza. But it's like the banks back in '98. Everybody said, well, these banks have been in bad shape for a long time. Can't this just go on forever? One day it became clear that it couldn't go on forever. And funding the Japanese government is like that. One day we could see a small risk premium in the bond market one day, and the next day a big risk premium. And then the Japanese economy is in the same shape that several of the banks were 4 years ago. We can't afford to let that happen. But it's very difficult if you're a politician to get people excited when the cliff isn't obvious to everybody. There's a second reason why it's insidious, and that's that the problems look so big that people are afraid that if you pull on the string, the whole sweater will unravel, and they're terrified because they don't see an upside. And there, I think, we can clarify the situation, because as Ezra said, there's a huge upside. This is one of the most talented, disciplined, technologically advanced civilizations the world has ever seen. And when the U.S. had similar banking and obsolescence and uncompetitiveness problems in the 80s and addressed them, the upside was enormous. The upside was the 90s. We see China and Korea addressing the problems. They have much, much worse problems than Japan does. But they're growing like crazy. And even the Korean banks are starting to, in some cases, look good. So there's a huge upside. We could be sitting here 10 years from now talking about Japan as the leader of the world. Finally, there's a sense in many circles that democracy is the problem, particularly when you compare China with Zhu Rongji addressing these banking problems and these corporate bankruptcy problems very decisively, and Japan not. Fortunately, democracy isn't the problem. We see the Japanese people saying 85% of them. When a candidate for prime minister says, I'm going to impose very painful solutions. Everybody's going to suffer a little bit. If necessary, I'll destroy the LDP. That gets 85% support. That's not normal democratic behavior. Normally you have every interest group going after its particular desires. This is probably the most highly educated, most aware population in the world, and they want reform. The problem is to get the democracy translated through the system to the government. But the most optimistic thing, ultimately, about Japan is that the people are saying, okay, it's time. Let's do something, even if it's painful.
Bill, let me press you one step further on that, which is Mr. Shiozaki said that we need to get rid of the overhang of bad debt. It's pretty widely accepted now that spending your way out of this problem by building roads to nowhere is not a solution. And you mentioned the fact that in the 1980s, when the United States had its savings and loan crisis, we set up a special fund and got rid of this overhang. I asked an economist friend of mine, why don't the Japanese just do that? He said, well, the official number of bad debts overhang in Japan is about 8% of GNP. But he said, I think it's more over 20%. So if you compare it to the American problem, it's about 10 times worse. Is that accurate?
I think it is about $1 trillion out of a $4.5 trillion economy. Yes, it's much, much worse. It's not as bad as China's. It's not as bad as Korea's. Probably getting rid of the bad debt problem would mean 3 or 4 million people losing their jobs. That's nasty. But if you wait, the number becomes 5 million or 6 million. So the important thing is to be mobilized by the bad number, not to be immobilized by it.
But let me then turn it back to you, Shiozaki-san. As a practicing politician, is it possible when you're dealing with such a large proportion of GNP to get agreement within the LDP or the Diet to take such an unpopular step? Isn't it much easier just to spend more money building roads to nowhere, which make people happy?
Well, I think the size doesn't really matter in terms of deciding what the government should do. And I think we lost the most precious chance of doing what your government has done after the SNL crisis, and also like in the case of Swedish bubble burst. And everybody did the same thing. And the size itself is a little bit different. But if you compare the size of non-performing loans in Japan and also the size of Swedish non-performing loans, I think it's vis-a-vis GDP, it's almost the same. And I don't think the size itself does not exclude the chance of attacking. And we really lost the best chance of solving it after Koizumi-san came in, because everybody thought that after Koizumi-san came into the office last year, Japanese economy is going to be up again, and the non-performing loan problem should be over. But he took a rather wrong, I would say wrong, priority of putting more stress on fiscal consolidation than on resolution of non-performing loans. And yes, we do need more taxpayers' money compared to your case. And of course, in Swedish case, but I think we cannot just postpone the timing of solving it. Otherwise, we're going to lose lots of other opportunities for the Japanese public and economy to enjoy.
Well, if I may add, the beginning of this year, there's a case of the Daiei, the supermarket thing. But then the impression that we are getting is that the government opted for muddle through rather than the take drastic measures. And in those days, the cliche was the too big to fail. But if we start saying the Daiei as the too big, then there are lots of other companies eventually who can be defined as too big. But so this is this sort of a defining moment, perhaps in hindsight. Never too late, but that's more or less a question of priority. And if muddle through is possible, so much the better. But that's very questionable, as you.
Well, I think what that means is the problem is soluble if you have enough political will, but then the question is political will. Ezra, you were optimistic in your prognosis that in the long run Japan will make it, and I share that. I've written that this is a country that's reinvented itself twice, and you should never write off somebody who can be that creative as Japan has been twice in history. But on the other hand, it's also worth noticing that both the shocks that brought about these huge changes in Meiji and after 1945 came from outside. Can Japan, with a crisis from inside, make those political changes to deal with a problem this size?
Well, I think that's the question we're all wrestling with, and I think it's the hope of many of us that they can do it before they have panic. I mean, one could think, I'm sure Bill could think of scenarios where investors would pull out their money or savers in Japan would pull out the money and invest abroad at a time of panic, and then things could happen fairly quickly. But that would be an awfully messy situation. And I don't see anything in the short run where that consensus is going to come together. I wish I could say that if X and Y and Z would come together, they could really solve it. But I don't see that now. I guess what I see is so many business people who would like to say that, but their friends are in trouble, so they don't want to go public because, you know, that would be very awkward in relation to their friends. And a lot of politicians also who realize that something needs to be done, but still they are going to need the support of the system if they're going to continue as important politicians. So I don't see that in the short run. I wish I could say I did. I don't see on the horizon. I think it may take a little bit bigger of a crisis in Japan before you get the mobilization.
Bill, you had referred to how powerful Japan will be when 25 of these people in front of you go back and are in the Diet helping Mr. Shiozaki. But what happens between now and 10 years from now?
Well, I think Shiozaki-san listed a number of political things that have to change. Much stronger prime minister with his own independent staff and some others. And when you think how that is going to be accomplished, it's going to take some kind of a political shock. Either the voters are going to get very upset and do something that shocks the system, or there's going to be a financial shock and the politicians and the voters are going to react to that. But one way or another, we're talking here about major political change, structural change, and the bureaucrats and the politicians will not just sort of do a rational calculation and say that's, yes, it would be good for the country. There's too much at stake. It's going to take some kind of a shock. We just have to hope that the shock is big enough but not too big.
Well, one would hope that with a shock the right size, that the Japanese voters will turn to you, Shiozaki-san, or perhaps Hayaki, or some other Kennedy School graduates. But a Japanese friend of mine said recently, don't be so sure of that. It's possible that if the shock is big enough, that the voters may go in a more populist direction, just as they've gone to Koizumi within the LDP that they may then go to Ishihara Shintaro or Tanaka Makiko or something that instead of thinking of the rational response, you may get a response of frustration, and that the voters will go too far from the shock. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think the popularity of Koizumi-san with a level of 40%, just as Kawashima-san said, it is high, but I think it's just simply a sign of frustration mounting in the Japanese, general public's mind. And they tend to go rather emotional, and Japanese tend to be very emotional. And Ishihara Shintaro and Tanaka Makiko could be one of the alternatives for Japanese to go after Koizumi-san. So I'm trying not to see that kind of situation in Japan. That means I have to keep supporting Koizumi-san and redirect his rather mistaken direction to a proper direction, so as not to go in a rather catastrophic stage of Japanese society.
Yutaka, is this scenario of my Japanese friend possible or not?
Well, I want to touch upon this sort of populism theme because I'm deeply worried about that. Well, it's not unique in Japan, but when things are in bad shape, the mentality can be whose fault. And as long as the self-reflection about what wrong did we do is healthy, but then often the political culture can be the best popular way is to finger point the enemy of the people. And that can be disruptive. And that's not, well, we witness the same symptom everywhere. But that is the worrisome aspect, but still, in the final analysis, I believe in the sanity of the system.
We now have come to the point of the program where it's over to you for your questions. There are 2 microphones here on the floor and 2 more on the staircases to the balconies. If you would line up behind the microphones to ask your question, I'd like you to identify yourself and say who you are and your relation to the university, and also to please keep your questions short when you raise a question. So who would like to enter this discussion? Don't be shy. This is your chance to ask one of the best politicians in Japan the answer. Okay.
I'm Toru Miyamoto, the Fletcher PhD student, been here for a couple of years. So my question to you is how to make a constructive relationship between the government and the bureaucrat and the politician. Because as you mentioned, the Mr. Koizumi's mistake is a strategic one that make a wrong priority. I understand the biggest problem is he have to rely on the institution, Ministry of Finance. But if you were Prime Minister, I mean, I hope and I believe it will, but my question to you is how to institutionalize the constructive relationship with government and the politician, leaders like you.
There should be twofold answers. One is change the personnel management policy of the civil servants. Now, the civil servants in Japan always pledge to the organization itself, not to minister or prime minister or widely defined national interest. And often, of course, good bureaucrats do work for national interest, but oftentimes limited by the organizational constraints. And so we have to change that policy in order to have bureaucrats with wider perspective. And the second point is that in order not to make prime ministers go in wrong direction, as I said in the speech presentation, he's got to have good sources of information and ideas independent from bureaucracy. And bureaucracy could come up with right set of solutions, but sometimes not. And prime ministers who are responsible for the general public at large must decide what is a proper and correct decision the prime minister must make for the sake of the happiness of the public. That means we have to institutionalize, as you said, some formal staff, full-time advisors, basically, in my view, independent from bureaucracy, within Prime Minister's office, and also in each ministry. I think ministers should have their own sources of information and ideas, and full-time. That is the most important point. Otherwise, we've had lots of not full-time, part-time advisors, but they are always overwhelmed by the bureaucracy who are always full-time there.
Could I come in on this, Joe?
Yes.
I think the politicians in Japan, because they've not been involved in policy, have not had the policy staff, say, that the American Congress has had, and they haven't had the independent institutions. That's where I think Shiozaki-san's point about the independent institutions is very important. And the problem with the bureaucracy, it seems to me, is that they can do their job properly defined quite well. But when you're at a critical turning point where you require changes in the society, fundamental changes, bureaucrats cannot make those kind of changes, and they require as politicians. In order to do that, they have to have more power. They can't give the bureaucrats as big an area to make decisions as they used to. They have to acquire more of their own. And a lot of the bureaucrats are going to naturally, in fact, resist this. I think one of the neat structural changes that's been made now is that politicians have to testify in the Diet, because that means to testify in the Diet, you have to know something about what you're saying. It used to be the bureaucrats that did all the testifying. So now, because the politicians have to testify, they have to learn more about it. Now that means when they appoint their vice ministers and ministers, the political appointments in the ministries, they're going to get brighter guys who can learn enough. And the bureaucrats are going to resist. And they're going to try to keep those guys from knowing too much because they want to protect their turf. But I think in the long run, the politicians are going to have to grab a lot more control and have more staff with them to be able to do it. And I think, in a way, the Koizumi-san's failure, in my view, has a lot to do with this, that he didn't have enough independent staff, enough strength, enough organization to be able to carry out some of the ideas that he wanted to.
In the balcony.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. My name is Masanori Tsuruda, a second-year public policy student here at Kennedy School. I am curious at the term, the national interest you used at the beginning of your speech. And I think when I watch the Japanese TV or whatever, I often see many politicians use the term national interest. And, but I've never seen that what the content of the Japanese national interest really is. So I think in the politics, there seems to be some inflation of the definition of national interest in Japan. So I'm very worried about that kind of definition of national interest in Japan. And so especially in the realm of foreign policy, it is very important to have relatively clearly defined national interest to construct better policy. So my question to Mr. Shiozaki-san is, are there any serious discussion about to think about the Japanese interest for the futures? And in your opinions, what is the top 3 Japanese foreign policy issue right now?
I think what we are suffering in Japan is a kind of lack of control tower with the so-called national interests. And I used national interest, but I didn't use it, meaning specific national interest. The national interest should be defined not just by politicians or prime minister or other ministers, but together with the voices of people from all over Japan through Diet members and all that. But we didn't really simply have no control tower, which combines the consensus view of national interest on each specific issues. And for example, the safeguard against the Chinese imports to vegetable and a couple other agricultural stuff. That decision was not, as I see it, decided according to the well-defined national interest. It was just decided by those who have strong interest, vested interest in agriculture. And by doing that, I think other manufacturing sectors lost quite a bit. So you are right that politicians often say, for the sake of national interest, but that shouldn't be the national interest defined only by politicians, but through democratic process, which could be very tedious.
Left balcony.
Hello, my name is Phyllis Maloney. I'm an undergraduate, and I will be going to Japan this summer as part of the Kawamura Visiting Fellowship Program. My question is, what role do you see Japanese youth playing in the re-emergence of Japan, and how are they being prepared for it? What role
will youth play, and how you're preparing youth for it?
Youth.
Yes, sir.
Youth as a group, I wouldn't see any specific movement yet. But for example, in my election district, I do have regular meeting with students and people in the 20s, and have serious discussion. And by doing that, we can learn what the youth are really feeling and also wishing to happen. And also, like the case in the NGOs activities, they are basically 20s and 30s, and actively helping people outside of Japan, and sometimes in Japan too, so-called widely defined NPOs. They're composed of young generation people, and they do have influence on us. And because of the lack of information of what's happening, like for example in the cases of Afghanistan or other conflicting areas like Iraq and all that, those parts are rather vacant of information through, I'm sorry, from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and younger generation do know better than bureaucrats in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's true in other cases too. So we try to listen more to those people who have informations and ideas that are not coming from the bureaucracy or other conventional business circles or academia.
Thank you.
Bill?
Just on that one, I think in many ways the kids are transforming the system already, and the kids are just about everybody under 45. Major parts of the old system revolved around things like your loyalty to the company comes first, to the family second. The under 45s are saying, hey, not for us. And they're moving more comfortably among companies, trying out more things in their lives. They're much more cosmopolitan generation. So this isn't defining policy on non-performing loans yet, but the system is changing, and not in an organized, confrontational way, but people are just behaving very differently. I think we're seeing a whole new Japan emerge here.
I I recall a couple of other good examples of the movement of youth by youth for promoting reforms in Japan. That is, Junior Chamber of Commerce. They started out the open discussion before the elections, not just on national level, but on local level in each district. And it is now common to have open discussion among the candidates before the election. And that wasn't observed, say, five years ago. So that's a great, push from the youth to make reforms in a political style of Japanese politics.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Shinji Hirai. I'm a Kennedy School student majoring in international development. My question is about ODA. Since Japan is in recession, there is an opinion that Japan should cut aid because Japan is in recession. But on the other hand, internationally, there is more and more pressure to Japan that Japan should increase more aid in terms of GDP. So my question is, what kind of vision do you have to improve Japanese aid to developing countries? Thank you.
Twofold. One is, I think we should focus more on the field or countries that are really important, of course for Japan, but also for the people there. And the second is, we are our ODA is rather heavily dependent on lending, not just, giving the money itself, but through lending to countries. And I think it's more effective by taxpayers' money to assist people outside. Like in the cases of Scandinavian countries, I think their ODAs are 100% money given straight to the countries needed. But in Japan, I think it's about I can't remember the exact number, but a quite big portion of ODA is lending. And I think we should, that's because we have excess savings nationwide. But I think we do need that kind of lending in some fields, but I think we should, again, focus on the fields that are really needed.
You talking?
Well, in January this year, this conference on Afghanistan, the reconstruction was held in Tokyo. And after the conference was over, the Ogata Sadako, who did the co-chair in that conference, said that it was, after all, nice thing for Japanese to learn that in spite of all this economic difficulty in Japan, there are lots of people in the world who are having really terrible poverty and suffering from that. And in fact, it was heartening to notice that on that occasion, that conference, the Japanese government pledged about $400 or $500 million in 2 years, a huge amount. But actually, it was very well received in Japanese domestic scene. And in spite of all this economic difficulty, that's a sort of encouraging sign. But meanwhile, the strong sort of criticism voiced by some quarters about Japan's ODA towards China, it's somewhat different context, or why Japan should be assisting China in sort of arguments. And that will be complicating the much of ODA assistance, also in the context of lending money things. But overall, I think there's a firm support, understanding among Japanese that in this 21st century to take care of the poverties and the privation of the other people is still important agenda.
どうもありがとうございました。 Thank you very much for coming and have a good speech. My name is Taku Nakaminato, mid-career student, Kennedy School of Government. And I believe, and I had better believe, that Japan is attractive in economy as well as in foreign policy. And in order to survive in the international world, what kind of foreign policy, including defense policy, Japan should take? And I would like to ask this question to Mr. Shiozaki and other panelists. Thank you.
Well, I think we need 1 hour or so to talk about foreign policy, because we have Dean Nye with a specialist in security issues. I think our security policy is now changing. For the past several years, I think moving towards, to me, it's a preferable way by committing more in the international issues, but by keeping our peace-loving country status. And as far as I feel, I think we should fully use the peace-loving country's status as much as possible. But still, I think in PKO's operations, I think there are still lots of limitations in Japan to contribute as the people in trouble there are really wishing for the two Japanese to act in the troubled areas. So we have to be careful or not to go too far, but still I think we should be more so-called normal way, but still keeping the Article 9 status as ever.
Yes, sir.
I think since 9/11, there is a special niche that Japan can do very well, and that's with the dialogue with the Islamic world. And Japan is still the biggest donor to ODA, and they play a very big role. And I think that Afghanistan example is a good example of the kind of role that Japan can play in organizing big donor events. But I think also the United States, and I think some of the white people may have more, Caucasians have more trouble dealing with, say, Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia and so forth. And I think Japan, as a non-Caucasian country, has a good opportunity to reach out and help bridge that dialogue to that part of the world. I think a very constructive role that Japan can play.
The foreign minister is now in Europe, but she's going to Afghanistan and Iran. But I kept proposing to the foreign ministry that she should go to Israel and Palestine to contribute some way. Although lots of people would say, what could we do in that kind of rather too complicated case? But I think there should be some, as you said, by using the status of ODN and all kind of stuff. But I think Minister of Foreign Affairs are a little bit reluctant to do that.
Yes, Alki.
Arnold Seman, I'm political econom visiting, and I am tremendously impressed by your courage, because you never need, and no one needs so much courage to change political system of vested interests. We tried it in Central Europe 15 years ago, and that's tremendous. You need support. I would suggest just 2 slight remarks before I get to my question, that the SEC Commission must be independent and cannot be self-governing, because our SEC Commission is corrupt all the way through. I worked for New York Stock Exchange for Chairman's Office 3 years. I know their practices. Stay away from that. The other one, if you are talking about lawyers, I would suggest Shakespeare. He had one short note on that issue. And I just would like to know, my question is really, how do you prevent 5-10 years from now similar overhang due to bad trading policies that you have now? What are the structural changes that you recommend, not procedural, that you talked about, but structural changes that will prevent this from happening.
What happened?
What are the structural
Structural
changes
changes.
that you would suggest
So that this doesn't happen again.
Non-performing loans.
Non-performing loans.
10 years from now?
Very easy. Better corporate governance of the banks and good watchdog function of the government on banking sector.
Left balcony.
More optimistic than I am.
My name is Koji Shimaru from MIT, and I assume that Mr. Shiozaki is minority in LDP. I guess the majority is
black
still.
sheep in LDP.
I guess. Sorry. No. In politics area, that I guess majority is the still interested in local issues like building roads in nowhere, and we as a student studying here, after we go back to Japan, we will be a minority too. And I'm curious that I'd like to know your idea or your plan to increase your support inside the political world, inside the political arena. Thank you very much.
I think there are a growing number of Diet members who have experience working outside of Japan and also have experience of studying outside of Japan, like you. And those Diet members are usually reform-minded. And as I said in the presentation, there are a number of Diet members in the group who are trying to change the system of decision-making process and all that. And so maybe you should come back to Japan and run for the Diet. That could be the right solution to change Japan.
My name is Jian Yang. I'm a fellow with CBG. When we look at East Asia, we see that Japan is no longer the engine of the growth. And China is facing enormous economic challenges, more so with its entry into WTO. Southeast Asia, it seems that has not been in good shape after the 97 financial crisis. And they are worried about the lack of growth on part of Japan. They are also worried about the competition from China. So my question is, it seems that we still have to wait some time for the political change to happen in Japan. So while we are waiting, maybe some bigger shock than the right size will happen in Japan. If that does happen, what will be the implications of that for Asia, especially for China?
I think the sole goal of Japanese politics is to avoid that kind of big turbulence to
I mean economic shock, not
economic shock coming from Japan
in
to
Japan happens because it seems that now you have this bank crisis and everything going on, deteriorating. Nothing can be done before you have this political change. So if someday it collapses, so suppose what will happen then?
what happens if the crisis really happens in
Implications
Japan?
of that crisis for Asia economy, especially for China and maybe other regions.
If that happens in Japan, of course, that would have tremendous detrimental effect on the Asian economy. But as I said, the sole purpose of us as politicians is to try to avoid that kind of crisis to happen. And we are not that successful yet, but I will keep trying harder.
This is going to have to be our last question.
Thank you. Harvey Shaikhan. I'll describe myself as a student at large, as Ezra has found out, and Bill will. Anyway, we're talking about the need, perhaps, of a major shock to the economy, in some manner, to put in motion all of the corrective measures that are needed. And in the past, those shocks have come from the outside, apparently. I'm wondering whether potential outside shocks might be, one, China and Taiwan becoming critical, or two, the two Koreas becoming critical, or something of that nature? What would occur in the Japanese economy?
Do you mean critical of Japan, or they would unite? I mean,
No, not critical of Japan, but it strikes me that if China and Taiwan should heat up, you're going to have some sort of reaction in Japan, perhaps even the feeling of need for rearming and changing the Chapter 9 or whatever it's called.
The question is, in other words, if there should be conflict, say on the Korean Peninsula,
military
or if there
conflict.
should
Oh,
be
military,
tension,
yes.
if the
Military
tension
conflict.
between Taiwan and China would heat up,
That's
then
right.
what impact would that have on Japan?
Correct.
In Japanese economy or politics?
How would Japan respond to that kind of conflict?
Yeah.
Okay, response to those conditions.
And would that be a sufficient shock to the Japanese economy to cause some corrective measure?
It depends on how the military operation would come out. Like in the case of Korean War, that really helped Japanese economy back again. But I don't think that would happen, and I do not think that there is going to be a direct impact, economic impact on Japan, but maybe through larger operational effects of the military activities of the United States, and possibly some help from the Japanese side, would have detrimental impact on Japanese economy, as happened after September 11th.
Bill, you wanted to comment on that?
If you're talking about actual warfare that's fairly large scale, I think in Korea or between China and Taiwan, I think that would create more demand for the strongest sectors of the Japanese economy, and it would hold off a crisis. This is what the Japanese economy is good at. Mobilizing heavy industry, and others, especially the United States, but also people like the South Koreans would be buying lots of the stuff that the Japanese economy is best at providing. So I think it would hold things. It would forestall a crisis. It would forestall change. On the other hand, if the United States did something that Japanese really didn't like, and this provoked a very nationalistic reaction and brought somebody like Ishihara Shintaro to power, then you would probably get significant economic changes, including significant economic reforms. At this point, the scenario is a little far-fetched. Have to work very hard at that one.
Obviously, these situations would inflict more serious discussion on security policies in Japan, but I'm not sure about what kind of economic impact that would have. Those would have, because it depends on what kind of operations that would be led.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. I'm sure we could go on for much more of the evening. We've heard some pessimistic views from parts of the panel about the economic situation currently, but we've also heard a good deal of optimism about the future. And I think the sign of optimism is to have a politician as thoughtful and frank as Mr. Shiozaki with us. And as I understand it, as soon as 25 of you go and run for the Diet and support him, everything is going to be all right.
Right.
So please join me in thanking the panel for this good evening. Very good.
I saw that very expensive seat of yours.
So,
No, you paid less money for this seat. His was very expensive.
Yeah. But of course, you know, so he has a right to enjoy such kind of privilege.
I see.
He organized everything. No, you should. How does it? He style.